Welcome to another episode of Cloud Dialogue. Today we have Georgia as per usual, in a slightly different part of the world than she's always in. And we've got a special guest, Chris Munn from
Thanks.
Amazon.
Hello,
Say hi,
everybody.
Chris.
Thank you for having me, Matt and Georgia. I appreciate it.
Today's topic is a topic that comes up quite a bit in conversation with customers, and I think there's always internet,
hmm
Twitter threads and threads. We don't call Twitter X, but Twitter threads and LinkedIn conversations. There's always the topic of lock-in that comes up, and I see it as sometimes an excuse for people not to do things. But the funny thing is, I think lock-in's been around for a while, and I guess, and maybe you shouldn't think about lock-in as a negative thing, and you got to use it as a mechanism to think about what you're building and the services that you're consuming, and I guess use it as part of the thought process to see whether you're using the services that are available to you in the most efficient manner or not. And I think that helps drive that conversation a little bit. So, bit of an intro to Chris. Chris, just give a quick background
Yeah.
on yourself.
So, at Chris Munns, I'm based outside of the New York City area these days, or in the greater New York City area, I guess you would say. About to hit the 12-year mark at Amazon Web Services. A couple different roles. I left for about 6 months in the middle of beginning of 2015 at one point, but about 12 years of total service to cloud, as it were. By background, a DevOps person, an SRE person, that's admin, right? That's what we'll call it. Before Amazon, took care of servers and did rack and stack and did Linux and, taught myself Linux in the late 90s. And yeah, was at a bunch of startups, did a kind of a required tour of duty at a hedge fund in Manhattan at one point in time, which if you live in the New York City area, you work in tech, like you're required to work at a bank at some point. Like you just kind of have to do it. At AWS, been in a lot of different roles. People might know me from being the lead of the service developer advocate team for about 5 years. So I kind of founded and created that team, got to represent Lambda and API Gateway. Before that, I led global business development for DevOps. And for the last about 2 years, 9 months, I've been the tech lead for North America in the startup organization. So I work with a lot of startups, primarily in North America, and do all sorts of things with them, internally facing, externally facing. But I get to work with some pretty cool companies and get to work on some pretty hard problems. And as my Misty kind of gray hair right now will attest to, kind of many will say dog years at Amazon, as it were, over the last, almost 12 years. So
Cool. Thanks, Chris. You seem to always get involved in conversations about
yeah,
locking. I'm just trying to
yeah,
figure
yeah.
out why. It's a topic that, it's kind of annoying when the same arguments come up all the time. What do you think people mean when they talk about locking,
Yeah, well,
locking in
I
your
know the
world?
spark for this conversation here came from a tweet that I posted that, as the kids would say, did numbers and got picked up and created and stuff like that. But it was in response to me reading a comment somewhere, either on another Twitter slash X thread or on Hacker News or something like that, around a startup that has a managed database offering, but it's a managed open source database offering. And the commenter had kind of made a comment around, I would never use this due to the lock-in. And there's kind of this like, well, what do you mean do the lock-in? Like it managed Postgres or MySQL or Redis, whatever it was. I think, lock-in obviously uh, something I've had to talk about for many, many years now. When I joined AWS in 2011, the lock-in was probably like one of the big kind of counter arguments to why you'd want to use the cloud in the early days. I would say in my time, specifically in serverless with Lambda and that whole ecosystem, we kind of had to talk about lock-in and what that means and what it maybe doesn't mean, unfortunately almost every day. That and cold starts, which you've probably also seen me rail on. Can we please stop talking about cold starts already? Probably the two biggest topics that have dominated my life over the last decade, next to just speaking about EC2 and S3. And so, I think realistically, like as you said early on, Lock-in is a concept that people use to come up with an excuse to not have to do something, right? Use managed services, use the cloud, use technologies like Lambda. But I think there's realistically kind of a lack of like maybe what they're concerned about locking themselves into versus any technology decision that they make. So it just becomes one of the things that gets waved out there that it's hard to define, hard to understand the basis and reasoning for it. And it just becomes a really convenient excuse that people go, yeah, lock in. That doesn't sound good.
Again, Chris, I'm so glad that you're able to join us today because it's something that I feel like I get asked about a lot. And to be honest, a conversation that almost like frustrates me a little bit. I'm like, whatever you do with IT, to some
Mhm.
extent, you are locked in, right? There is a level of lock in for whatever you do. But I think there's kind of like two separate fears here just from like a psychological standpoint of executives when I talk to them about this. And the first is more around SIs and like, okay, if I'm going out to market looking for some sort of capability and I end up with a system integrator that does some sort of custom software, which then no other systems integrator knows how to run. Therefore, I'm stuck with that systems integrator for like infinitely or however long until I refresh the software. And then the other is, well, what specific software are we actually using? Like looking at obviously cloud service providers is one, right? Like microservices. And I always kind of thought, and this is probably like going down a different rabbit hole, that cloud was a little bit better in terms
Mhm.
of vendor lock-in, just because the microservices, in my view, having the microservices enables you to kind of configure things in your own kind of way, as opposed to some sort of custom setup on-prem. I think there are definitely two schools of thought. One is like around that SI, and the other is actually what's the technology that you're using. But at least with the microservices, they can kind of be used by any systems integrator, like it's not a proprietary, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to your point, there's different ways of looking at it. Even when I talk to startups, you know, there's something very different about a startup that's, really day one, just getting off the ground, building their MVP, going to look for investment. Those people don't care about lock in. They care about moving fast. And they're like, give me the information. Yeah,
Time to
give me the
value. Yeah.
information and the tooling, do as fast as I possibly can with the least amount of hurdles so that I can go out and raise capital or, get those early customers and be able to keep doing this in 6 months from now and have some money for it. And then you kind of see as these startup customers move later through their journey, maybe they gain some investment, they're starting to find product market fit. A lot of it is about, okay, now how do I accelerate even further, right? How do I move even further? So for in the earlier stages of startups, you don't hear a lot about lock-in generally. I think where you end up seeing a lot of it again comes down to a bit of Matt, what you were saying earlier is, the individual that has some sort of ego or some sort of bias. And it's kind of like, well, no, of course I have to run Kubernetes myself. How else would a man do this? Kind of a thing almost where this kind of personal cockiness towards this stuff. And then, oh, lock in is the counter argument, right? I have to do this because if not, lock it. And then I think what you were just saying, Georgia, about like SIs and enterprise customers, that risk aversion of like, hey, it might take us 12 to 18 months to finish this project. When that project is done and it goes live and the business is running on it, it effectively could be considered, done effectively. And 3, 5 years down the line, after I've amortized out this investment, and now maybe I need to make a new investment on it, am I going to find that I am locked into some previous technology or framework or paradigm or something like that? What it means and how it's used, there could definitely be a logical risk aversion at one end. And then at the other end is this, personal bias, maybe resume padding driven model of, well, yeah, if I use this managed thing, then I'm not doing it. And then that lessens my value inside of the business.
I find that very interesting that people want to spin up a Kubernetes cluster to run their stuff, and because they don't want to be seen as being locked into the managed services or Lambda or whatever, and yet they're locking
Make it
themselves.
make sense.
Yeah.
make it make sense.
And yet
Like,
they're, well,
but
I'll-
that's often the idea, right? It's like, oh, if we containerize, then we can avoid lock-in. And I'm like,
yeah, but you
no.
have a whole lot of other, you have a whole lot of other responsibilities you got to take care of. And then you've got this cluster to take care of. And you're, I, I mean, you're technically locking yourself into another platform that will be hard to get out of,
It's
right?
just a different
A
one.
lot of
This is a
profit.
different one.
Exactly. And that's the point.
Choose your lock-in, right? Like whatever
Choose
you
your
do,
plan.
choose your lock-in. Yeah. And I mean, like, you can go and assess case like as you go and move things to cloud, like let's look at every workload and think about how locked in we are. But like, what's the point? I really ask, what's the
Yeah.
point? Regardless of any sort of technology choice. And I mean, again, managed services is another example, right? And I get questions like, oh, should we don't want to be locked in. So should we use managed services? Your time to value is so much faster. Why make that decision based on something that might happen in the future as opposed to something that you know is going to happen, i.e. we need to move stuff to cloud, accelerate the time to value, think about vendor lock-in,
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
hate that term. I find the term really frustrating. Think about that when you realize that you actually do need to do something as opposed to worrying about something that might
Exactly.
never happen.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we've both, George and I, were talking before we started recording here about our overlap in our professional lives here. And that comes with a certain, we'll say, training on messaging and how we talk about certain concepts. But yeah, I think, yes, broadly, any technology decision you make implies a blocking out of other technology decisions for now and for the immediate future. For any type of an organization, once you decide to point and go down a certain path, whether it be with a database technology or a programming language, or maybe a framework that's on top of that, there's an implication of like, okay, we are not going to be able to easily deviate from this path if we invest really heavily into it. I think there is an aspect of like having a mature conversation around what it means to make that decision within a business, to pick a technology. Is this the kind of technology where if we do need to pivot, is the cost of that pivot so strong that it effectively deters that pivot, right? That could be like a fair, I think, way to think about lock-in. It's like the cost of changing this, not like, can we do it or can we not? Just the cost of doing it is really great. There was an example I was thinking about as I was on my commute home today from New York City, and I was thinking about how, just in the last few years, pretty much every major Linux distribution had to make a, pivot from Python 2.7 to Python 3, whatever, for tooling, right? Like Red Hat had to do this, Fedora, CentOS, a number of them had to do it because a lot of their core utilities were based on older versions of Python, to the point where you couldn't even like mix and match them because all the system paths, the libraries and stuff were all pointed in that way. And so it's like, is that a form of a lock-in? Like years for Red Hat to move from Python 2.7 to Python 3. Whatever. And so every decision that you make, and I'm sure, Python 2.7 had been around for like over a decade at this point or something. At least like the Python 2 family. Was that a lock-in decision? Probably not, but it's the kind of thing where they were committed to a technology for so long that an ecosystem had been built up around it and standardized and normalized, and pivoting from that was major upheaval for the, Linux new open source community to take all these tools and rebuild them effectively, or at least update them for that other language. Again, there's an aspect there of like, how do you know 10 years ago that Python 2.7 is going to end up causing so much upheaval in the lives of the open source community, 10 years later? You just don't know these things. And so, again, I think a lot of times when you hear people concerned about lock-in, it's like, well, what is your window of time for this concern? It's like, yeah, in 10 years, is Lambda going to be the best way to run an application in the cloud? Probably not. Something better is going to come around. And that was me slyly implying that Lambda is the best way to run an application today. All right. Assume that we were to all say, yes, fine. In 10 years, there's going to be something different. is it appropriate to say that application that was written today may have to be rewritten in 10 years? Yeah, that probably is just going to happen. But does it mean that adopting a technology like that today is a form of lock-in? Probably not.
You're constantly refactoring anyway, right? I always think like, the thought that we're going to have to do all this refactoring to change technology, but we're all constantly refactoring anyway. So it's not really a significant deviation from like if you consider that if you consider it will happen in the future, right? Not knowing that, we're always refactoring anyway. It's not like it's going to be a non-BAU way of working
Yeah.
almost. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. In today's application development world, and we talk about CI and CD, and you talk about, like you're saying, continuous application evolution. Yeah, like what is the window of time that implies a lock-in versus like we've committed to this technology stack?
And don't forget over time we've had many different database engines, right? And databases can't go in and out, and databases evolve as well. Same as Red Hat, right? Postgres is going for so many different versions. You're choosing a database. You have no choice. You have to choose a database, and you need to be mindful of the limitations of that database. But again, as long as you can get your data out, and that's kind of what it comes down to, right? As long as your data is available, even Dynamo, people complain about that being not DynamoDB. I'm locking myself into a way of storing my data and querying my data. Well, actually, no, you've made a choice because it's a fully managed service that you don't have to do a lot of stuff to do to get it to work. And you've got to plan your queries and everything, which is slightly different to other technologies, but I'd argue you still have to do that anyway, no matter which technology you're choosing. Having that choice, I think, is a good thing because it's making you move quicker, move faster, build things quicker. As you were saying about moving fast from a startup perspective, there's never been sort of more possibilities about building quickly because there's so many managed services to choose from. And that's the benefit that people, I guess, sometimes forget about. Maybe they conveniently forget about that. But as someone building something myself, I'm always the lazy one to choose that. I want to choose the thing that's going to get me there quicker. And there's that other point, I guess, of that does come with some potential questions later about switching costs, right? So I think that's an important point that people maybe forget about.
Yeah. I mean, I think at the end of the day, switching costs realistically is what people mean to talk about when they say lock-in.
Yeah.
The actual question.
Very rarely is the true like, nope, you can't ever change this. They're like, oh, nope, you're stuck forever. You'll never be able to undo this. Yeah, if you cut off a finger, yeah, you can't undo that. You're locked into that decision, right? But choosing a database technology or choosing a programming framework, the real thing that you're concerned about is the long-term switching cost. And again, a lot of times when you think about why you might switch in the future, you don't even know why. Like, you don't really know what it is that might cause you to do that later down the road. Is it a premature optimization to think about switching costs, 3 to 5 years down the line for an application stack? These days, people stay at jobs for less than 2 years, kick it down the road to the next step. But I think even from like the perspective of, an enterprise that's risk averse, I mean, there's enterprises out there running Windows Server from the early 2000s. They're not doing it because they're risk averse, right? They're not doing it because they're locked into something. They're doing it because the switching cost for them isn't worth the squeeze of needing to do that. Switching cost optimization ahead of time is just like one of these things where, if you get the ability to pick that right all the time, like you should be playing the lottery.
Yeah, that's true too. And it's about assessing all those risks and the probability of those eventuating, which leads you to the technology decisions you make. and you're always taking into account those switching costs and your speed to market. And, there's no one metric, right? There's a combination of metrics, and it's usually nothing in isolation. So I think people need to think a little bit more like that and not just focus on that one thing about being locked in, well, Lambda function means I can't move my code elsewhere. Actually, no, that's not true, because it's just a controller of your code. And if your business logic is going to be the same, no matter which technology it lives on, right? And people forget that, and they just conveniently make that argument, I feel. And obviously, it's not just Lambda. Every cloud provider has some sort of system like that. And yeah, there's obviously the cloud provider proprietary APIs, but again, they usually map, and as long as you abstract them like a good developer abstracting the things that you might need to switch out, again, the effort that you put in to do that work is a risk scenario. Do I need to put the effort in to abstract that out? If I'm a bank, maybe. If I'm, startup, probably not.
Yeah.
My job is
I
to
think,
move quickly.
I think there's another aspect of this of like, who is the entity providing the thing to you that you have a concern about risk for, right? And I think we've seen this over the years with primarily like application development frameworks that maybe go stale over time. The maintainers just kind of give up the passion project on it, or maybe like I know I've seen things come out of different startups or technology companies, and then they effectively just become abandoned. And if you're an organization that's maybe bought into consuming that thing or that tool, and the community doesn't survive or just wasn't robust to begin with, you could find yourself down the line with a thing that, oh, wow, now I have to support this thing. Now I have to own this thing. And I think that's a thing that, again, looks kind of like in a roundabout way, something you might want to think of as lock-in, or, again, implies potentially like a high switching cost or a high, a surprise TCO that you weren't expecting something to have. I think it's where paying attention to the provider of the thing that you're evaluating really matters. There's a lot of startups that build tools that gain some level of adoption, and then the startup doesn't make it, or the startup gets pushed up by some private equity firm and gets squeezed down to look like something different. We've definitely seen in the past some of these projects end up deciding to take different turns on functionality or capability. And so every technology decision that you make implies some term of time of I'm bought into where this thing is going to go. The other side of it is if you're like, yeah, I can't handle any of that risk, I have to own the entire thing. That's where you start talking about lock into your people and lock into the way that those people are trained and hired and onboarded. And what do you do when the last person that knows the proprietary software stack decides to check out, right? You're having a really bad time. I think people sometimes, and again, in light of what kind of generated this conversation today, focus on lock-in typically kind of at the front door of a technology stack component decision. And they don't really think about all the chain on events of like, what happened? What happens if I decide to maintain this thing? What happens if I decide to take full ownership of this thing? What happens if I decide to build my own framework? I'm sure each of us probably has a story of a company that we worked at where it had its own framework. Before I worked at Amazon, I worked at Etsy for a while. Etsy had like 2 or 3 frameworks at one point in time. That was a pretty heavy weight on the business to evolve through how we wanted to expand and grow our technology stack in respect to the, lock-in by the frameworks that we had chosen. But at the time, they allowed the business to accelerate and move rapidly. And so we had a potentially heavy switching cost out the other side of that. But the company went on to be massively successful and IPO and be a publicly traded company and all of that. And so when we were 30 people and we picked a Python framework to talk to databases that eventually died and went stale, did that impede the business from becoming a, multi-billion-dollar publicly traded business? Probably not. Did it frustrate a number of us who were there in the employee, 30 to 60 range for about 9 months? But
That's a great example.
Yeah. That's the
Yeah.
happy one, right? That's like the end of it is like, oh wow, there's a really huge
Yeah.
success. The other ones are of course the ones where you have a startup that makes a decision to own something, and then the person who owned it leaves. And then the rest of the team is scrambling to figure out, what do I do with this thing? That could be for any technology decision that you see. It happens all the time, just all the time.
Um, Matt, should we just touch on like quickly other outliers, like really regulated industries?
There's one of the arguments that people put forward is cloud provider failure, for example, cloud going under or region dying or, but that's the same as a vendor going out of, similar to a vendor going out of business.
Yeah.
So I guess a lot of those are the arguments for, I've got to be able to move out. But, again, it's about risk, right? Well, what do you think around that area?
I guess if you have a use case where that was too much of a risk, then it probably isn't for cloud.
Possibly,
It would be
if the
my
risk is
view.
so
Is
high.
that like if the risk of that is such a concern, then should it just stay on premise?
I don't know if necessarily on premise, but I mean, we've definitely seen, or I've personally seen companies in heavily regulated spaces, whether they be, government or, private businesses or public businesses, whatever, where they've said, hey, due to the regulations imparted upon us, like we can't use managed services where we don't have control to, X, Y, Z. And it's like, cool, you're going to have to, build it yourself on the virtual compute products we have. And again, we get to help you own from the
Yeah.
hypervisor down and you own from the OS up. Or, maybe it's a situation where they can use a container orchestration product and they're owning that themselves, right? Like there's a lot of people running Kubernetes on, just virtual compute in the cloud today without using one of the cloud provided managed products for that. I mean, those are all, some of them are individualized business decisions. Some of them are government restrictions, and some of it is just stuff that you can't deal with easily. I mean, I think in the early days, I'm probably not remember this as clear as it could be. In the early days of my time, at my current employer, where like healthcare regulated apps in certain countries could not run in the cloud. They like legally couldn't. Like you had to be able to say, this person's PII
Yeah.
lives at this address, like in this physical building data center. And like, nothing I can do to help you with that, but we're not going to
Yeah.
give you the address of the data centers and can't come visit them or anything like that, And so, I mean, I think, an aspect of policy had to change. And you've seen this now. Again, I'm going on 12 years of actual employment time in cloud at Amazon, but I've been a AWS customer since the earliest days. The evolution of government understanding and consumption and laws and things about this stuff has changed all across the Americas, Europe, Asia, Southeast Asia. All this stuff is pretty much normalized now, but the growing pains of the regulatory controls really had to kind of be explored. And there's still quite a lot of that out there. It just is what it is.
There's definitely still people like organizations going through that, is that the regulations just haven't even kept up with cloud at a, really
Mhm.
high level. And they still are, like, we need to visit the data center. Well, no, that's not going to happen.
I want to visit my
et
data.
cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I want to come and say
Yeah.
hi to it. I want to pet it.
Yeah,
Visit my
No.
data.
I want to
Yeah,
touch
the
that
kind of
server.
joke was, and I don't believe this was really what we used to do, but in an office building that you can literally see the US Capitol building from, AWS had an office for many years, and they basically took like a coffee room area and behind glass, they set up a couple racks of servers. And this was before we had like our Outpost product, which is like you can run the server yourself, but you can manage the AWS console. And they would just be like, it looks like a lot of these in a data center. It's like, that's what it looks like. It looks like a lot of these racks of servers in a data center. And if you've seen a data center, you know what it looks like. Physically visiting our data centers isn't going to do anything more for you except be like, it's a data center. Here it is. Here's a bunch of the blinky lights. Here's the whirring fan. It's chilly. Here we go. I think we've evolved past that where, maybe only very, very unique types of industries and types of customers ever need to really request the access. Thankfully, I don't deal with any of that stuff myself, so I can't formally say what that looks like. But yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot. There's still regulations that require certain data live in certain places, and that's fine. It is what it is.
Cool. Thanks for your time. I'm hoping this conversation, I think we're going to refer to it in future for listeners and our, executives out there. I hope it gives you an idea about this conversation and what it actually means. Some of your people in your organization might be directing you down a certain path. I think the key is to make sure that they're asking all the right questions and making decisions for the right reasons and not for, risk-based, and taking into account speed to market and all those switching costs and all those factors need to take into account those sorts of decisions to make sure that they're not actually sending the organization down a path which may not be the best thing for them. Yeah. Any other closing thoughts?
I'll just say from my side again, it really is the kind of thing where you want to understand, like, what is the aspect of lock-in that we're concerned with, right? Is it a switching cost? Is it hey, this is a one-way decision. We're not going to be able to come back from it without something brand new to replace it. Evaluating the aspects of like, who and what is providing this technology? Is that a reliable thing? Is it something I have trust in? If I have trust in it, then I could probably make certain assumptions. Again, just determining that root reason why people would use this term lock-in and what they really mean. I find a lot of these arguments fall apart really quickly on average and can be appropriately massaged to a comfortable place. But at the end of the day, what are you really trying to accomplish? Some sort of business goal, right? Speed, time to market, growth, pleasing customers. There's a lot of ways to do that while adopting lots of different technologies, while not having this be a fear that holds you back.
For sure. Cool. Thank you for
Thank
your
you for having
time.
me.
Good conversation. And please, send us feedback, listeners, feedback at cloud-dialogues.com. We're always, and questions and suggestions for future episodes as well. So, and guests, any guests that they want on. So thank you. Until next time.
Cheers.
Goodbye.